Number 10. MS-13. The most dangerous gang currently active right now in the United States of America is by far the MS-13. For years now, the violent MS-13 gang, which has its origins in El Salvador, has been terrorizing New York City, Long Island, and the surrounding area. According to the New York Times, federal prosecutors have linked the gang to over 55 murders in just the past 10 years. The gang has perpetrated a wave of violence that has left entire blocks bloody. The MS in MS-13 stands for Mara Salvatrucha, and there are thousands of members of this gang all across the country. Most of the gang members are immigrants from Central America. Just recently in May, 10 men were charged in taking part in 3 murders in Queens, one of them on the platform of a subway, the other out in the open on a sidewalk, and the other near a public park. One of the victims was only 17 years old, beaten and strangled after the MS-13 gang members saw his tattoos and thought he was a member of a rival gang. In the end, he wasn't, and the MS-13 members killed a perfectly innocent person simply because he had the wrong tattoos. Number 9. Bloods and Crips. The Bloods have been around for years, nearly 5 decades to be exact. They formed in 1972 in Los Angeles as a street gang to rival an earlier street gang called the Crips. The Bloods can be identified by their members wearing the color red, while the Crips can be identified by the color blue. But have you ever wondered why these two gangs hate each other so much? The rivalry began even before the Bloods were formed as a real group. It started in the 1960s when a gang of Crips attacked 2 students at the Centennial High School in Compton. After the attack, one of the victims formed a new gang dedicated to protecting other people from the violent Crips. But the Crips were unstoppable, beating and killing everyone who got in their way, including other gangs like the Black P. Stones, the Athens Park Boys, and the Pirus. By 1978, a lot of these smaller gangs had formed an alliance and named themselves the Bloods. They then began securing different sections of the neighborhood that the Crips weren't allowed in. Thus began the territory wars. But all these years later, the Blood rivalry is still ongoing. Today, the Bloods have at least 15,000 active members in the eastern United States. The gang is heavily involved in the distribution of crack cocaine, and to be honest, that's pretty much their only game. Number 8. Aryan Brotherhood. The Aryan Brotherhood is a savage gang of neo-Nazis that operate both inside and outside of prisons in the United States. There are an estimated 20,000 members of what has been referred to as the oldest and most notorious racist gang anywhere in the country. According to the FBI, the Aryan Brotherhood makes up a significantly small percentage of the prison population, yet is responsible for the most murders. Like most street gangs, the Aryan Brotherhood focuses on drug trafficking, extortion, murdering people for money, and prostituting their fellow inmates for cash. As you most likely already know, the organization is white only. They're the most hardcore racists anywhere in North America. In order to become a member of the Aryan Brotherhood in prison, a new member is typically required to kill another inmate, usually of a different color. The origin of the Aryan Brotherhood isn't something well known. It began in the 1960s at a time when prisons in the U.S. were segregated. When segregation ended and the prison inmates began to be locked up with one another, inmates organized themselves into gangs based on race. The Aryan Brotherhood was the all-white gang, believed to have first been formed in the San Quentin State Prison. Number 7. The Yakuza. The Yakuza, the notorious Japanese mafia, has a larger influence in the U.S. than many people think. In fact, the Yakuza was once so powerful on U.S. soil that during the Obama administration, they had their assets frozen and were banned from conducting any business in the country. The measures were introduced by the U.S. Treasury Department in response to the increasing trouble with the Yakuza and human trafficking. They also had a pretty hefty hand in money laundering and illegal prostitution. Unlike the violent and disorganized street gangs, the Yakuza operated primarily like shady businessmen. Through their illicit activities, they brought in billions and billions of dollars a year in earnings. The U.S. couldn't actually stop the Yakuza from doing business, so instead, they targeted the 2 men at the top of the crime syndicate, Kenichi Shinoda and Kiyoshi Takayama. They froze their American-owned assets and basically banished them from the States. However, considering there are somewhere around 80,000 gangsters in Japan, others will simply take their place in America and keep up business as usual. Have you ever heard of this gang? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe buttons if you haven't already. Number 6. The Mexican Mafia. From what we can figure out, the best estimates place the gang being formed in 1957 by Luis Flores during his incarceration at the Duell Vocational Institution in California. The gang was created to protect Hispanics inside the California prison system, but by 1960 the gang had some serious power. They pushed their influence outside the prisons and began expanding into the public scene, raking in money from gambling, extortion, and the sale of drugs. The Mexican Mafia joined forces with street gangs in East Los Angeles and became an unstoppable force. They had unbelievable influence until the 1990s when police really came down on them and started to pull out the guts of their illegal machine. But in 1995, the FBI had used the RICO Act, the same act used to take down the Italian mafia, to charge 22 high-profile members. Unfortunately, after the devastating blow to the mafia's hierarchy, they simply reformed. They're still active today, continuing criminal activities throughout California. They don't wield the same power they used to, but they're definitely still around. Number 5. Barrio Azteca. The Barrio Azteca is one of the most savage and dangerous gangs to ever operate in the state of Texas. Their leader is even on the FBI's list of most wanted criminals. Their members just recently murdered a pregnant U.S. consulate and her husband. But their crimes don't stop at murder. They traffic human beings and drugs, they commit torture, and they're known as professional contract killers. They also operate on both sides of the border, with thousands of members in both Texas and Mexico. They're heavily associated with Mexican drug cartels, as well as 2 other gangs we talked about earlier, the Mexican Mafia and MS-13. But since Barrio Azteca is in bed with the cartels, they also have some cartel enemies. After all, nobody wars with each other quite like the cartels do. If not for their rivalry with the Sinaloa Cartel and Jalisco New Generation Cartel, Barrio Azteca would be significantly more dangerous. But as it is, most of their killing, drug dealing, and human selling is restricted to Texas, specifically around El Paso. Number 4. The Hells Angels. There's probably no gang in the United States more notorious than the Hells Angels, properly known as the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. But a lot of people don't actually know how the club came into being. It started in 1948 as a club for motorcyclists in California. Specifically, it started in Fontana, and they got their name from the bomber crews in World War II who called themselves the Hells Angels. By 1961, the gang had spread all the way in part of New Zealand. They became infamous by 1965 when the Attorney General of California, Thomas C. Lynch, issued a report on how motorcycle gangs were committing hoodlum activities. For their first few years in the spotlight, the Hells Angels were mostly known as dangerous outlaws. They were notorious barroom fighters, they were exceedingly violent, and the process to become one of the members included initiations that often had to do with committing illegal activities and even beating or killing people. It was the 1970s when law enforcement officials began to realize they were manufacturing and distributing methamphetamine. While the Hells Angels have lost much of their notoriety by now, they still have clubs functioning all across the world. Nowadays, they actually do a lot of charity work and toy drives, but their colorful past remains vivid. Number 3. The Mongols. The Mongols are a lesser-known bike gang, kind of similar to the Hells Angels. They too were made in California, but a few years later than the Hells Angels in 1969. They were nothing more than a mainstream motorcycle club, their goal to simply hang out and have fun. Today, the Mongols are considered to be one of the most dangerous gangs still in operation in America. They went from a mainstream club full of normal guys to an army of violent bikers in about 15 years. Today, most of the Mongols' 2,000 members are Hispanic males. Most of their favorite pastimes is racially motivated violence. They've become known to lash out at African American civilians and gang members indiscriminately. It was the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms that named them the most violent gang in America. This is in part because of the gang war they fought with the Hells Angels in the 1980s, gaining control of Southern California despite being tiny compared to the larger gang. They won the turf war by sheer force of will and unbridled cruelty. Number 2. Simon City Royals. The Simon City Royals were formed in 1952, making them one of the oldest gangs in continual operation anywhere in the U.S. They're also one of the largest predominantly white gangs involved in the country. In the 1960s, they were heavily involved with drug smuggling and racketeering, and were often involved in turf wars with other local gangs like the Latin Kings and the Imperial Gangsters. The Simon City Gang battled a gang called the Royals and lost, forcing the two gangs to merge together, becoming the Simon City Royals. The gang wars went on, like really on and on without end, until the 1990s when things finally started to calm down. It was always over turf and drug distribution. Today, the Simon City Royals still have a heavy presence in the prison system and still control parts of the Chicago North Side. They're also in Wisconsin and Mississippi. Number 1. The Black Spades. The Black Spades is a gang that started off in the Bronx in the late part of the 1960s and became wildly popular in the 1970s. The gang officially formed at a junior high school. They were just a bunch of kids influenced by groups like the Black Panthers and the Nation of Islam. In the beginning, they wanted to organize a fight against racism and bigotry. They policed their local neighborhoods to protect against the incoming scourge of drug dealers and drug addicts slowly taking over the community. There was even a chapter of Black Spades that was entirely female. Unfortunately, the Black Spades became too popular for their own good and started losing focus. The younger members became violent. They devolved into a criminal street gang peddling drugs, and they just kind of disintegrated. Amazingly, the Black Spades made a comeback in 2019 after changing their name to the Black Spades New Direction and becoming a community service program, offering food distribution to the less fortunate and championing anti-violence. Which of these gangs is the most terrifying to you? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and thanks for watching. If you haven't already, hit subscribe for all the latest videos from the channel.